work. So my normal routine on a Sunday morning is I get up fairly early to go over what I'm going to be preaching again and make sure that it seems like the right thing for the right day. So this morning my alarm went off at 4:45, and I got up and spent a little time in prayer and went over the sermon. And then I thought, I need to go out and run to kind of get the blood flowing. And it was still dark. I thought if I get out of the house before 6, I'll be able to get back, get cleaned up, and get to church on time. So I got out, and it was windier than I liked, but that was okay, and I was running, and I kept seeing these little, like, bugs coming down like this as in my headlamp as I'm running, and I thought, wow, there's a lot of bugs for this early in the morning. And then pretty soon, the bugs started hitting my face, and I realized it wasn't bugs, it was rain. So we were thankful for the rain, but it's not really what I wanted to run in this morning. But it worked out, and it is beautiful now. So our sermon this morning is a continuation. It's the Men of Jude, part 2. And if you were here last week, or if you watched online or something, you know that we started out in the book of Jude. And Jude is this short little book. It's one chapter. Most of our Bibles is just one page, and you can read it in just a few minutes. And we read Jude, and we find out that Jude was a warning to a church about false prophets. And it's this warning about false prophets that had snuck into the church, that were there. And Jude says they're like hidden reefs. So a reef is there, it's under the surface, right? A reef is underwater, but as a ship comes along, if it doesn't know it's there, this hidden reef will damage the ship. The ship will run aground. It will get a hole torn in the bottom of it, and it will be destroyed. Jude is saying these false prophets are like hidden reefs. They're in our midst, but they're under the surface. And then he also says that the false prophets are like wandering stars. And a star, especially for someone who's navigating, you want a star that is stationary. And so if you're in the northern hemisphere, you can look at the North Star and know it's always going to be in that spot. And based on that, you can decide how you're navigating. If you're in the southern hemisphere, where I grew up, we would look at the Southern Cross. And when Southern Cross always pointed, it was kind of like a kite, and it would always point to the south. And so you could always get a reference exactly where you were off the stars. But if you choose a different star, a wandering star, you can't navigate off of it because it's going to move. And you're going to look at it and you're going to say, okay, I'm following that star, and then pretty soon that star's over here. And then pretty soon the star's all around. And so Jude is saying, be careful. These false prophets, they're like wandering stars, and they're like shepherds who are taking care of their own needs and not the needs of anyone else. And so we're just going to go back. We're going to look at that passage real quick, and then we're going to move on. So in Jude, verses 11 to 13, Jude is saying about the false prophets, he says, woe to them, for they walk in the way of Cain and abandon themselves for the sake of gain to Balaam's error and perish in Korah's rebellion. These are like hidden reefs at your love feasts as they feast with you without fear, shepherds feeding themselves. Waterless clouds swept along by the wind, fruitless trees in late autumn, twice dead, uprooted. Wild waves of the sea casting up their foam of their shame, wandering stars for whom utter gloom, or for the gloom of utter darkness has been reserved forever. And so the last time I was here 2 weeks ago, I was struck by these three names, right? We have Cain, and we have Balaam, and we have Korah. And I was like, what did these guys do? Out of everybody that we have a record of in the Old Testament, in the First Testament, there's all sorts of stories of people who maybe weren't faithful. Why these three? Why these three? Why are they assigned this role of false prophets? And so we started digging into them. And last time we looked at Cain, and we saw that Cain had taken an offering to God, but it wasn't an acceptable offering, right? And he knew what he should have done. When his offering wasn't accepted, he got mad. He got mad for something that he had done, and then he took it out on his brother Abel. And he had this misconstrued view of God and didn't acknowledge God's true holiness because he didn't take him his very best. He didn't take God his first fruits like his brothers did. And so he went through the motions, and then he let his anger get the best of him. He took it out on someone else, and then he topped it all off by lying to God. So that was Cain, right? That was a summary of what we did last week. This week, we're going to look at the next person that Jude names. We're going to look at Balaam, and we're going to see why he was also included on this list. And last week, I'd mentioned, or last week, 2 weeks ago, whenever I was here, last time, I should say, we saw that Cain, he's really not mentioned in other places in the Second Testament other than just in passing. But Balaam was different because Balaam is mentioned 2 other times in the Second Testament, and neither one of these portrays him in good light. So 2 Peter is another passage similar to Jude that's dealing with false prophets. And Peter is writing this letter warning about false prophets. And he writes this about false prophets. He writes, "But these, like irrational animals, creatures of instinct, born to be caught and destroyed, blaspheming about matters of which they are ignorant, will also be destroyed in their destruction, suffering wrong as they wage for their wrongdoing. They count it pleasures to revel in the daytime. They are blots and blemishes, reveling in their deception while they feast with you. They have eyes full of adultery, insatiable for sin. They entice unsteady souls. They have hearts trained in greed, accursed children." That is how Peter is referring to false prophets. But then the very next verse says, "Forsaking the right way, they have gone astray. They have followed the way of Balaam, the son of Beor, who loved gain from wrongdoing." They followed the way of Balaam. That's what these false prophets have done. And so Peter is saying that these false prophets are like Balaam. They're following his example. And then he gives us a clue as to what the problem was. He says, he loved gain from wrongdoing. So keep mental note of that. Balaam loved gain from wrongdoing. And then another place where he's mentioned is the book of Revelation. And in the book of Revelation, starting in chapter 2, we have the series of letters to the different churches. Right? And most of these letters start out and they say something good, something encouraging, and then there's a but. But then you've got these issues that need to be resolved. And in the letter to the church of Pergamum, we see that. They're holding fast to Christ's name. That's great. We should all be holding fast to Christ's name, right? So he says, this is what you're doing right. You're holding fast to Christ's name. And then he goes on. He says, "But I have a few things against you. You have some who hold to the teachings of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the sons of Israel, so that they might eat food sacrificed to idols and practice sexual immorality." So the church was doing some things right. They were holding fast to God's word, but they were following Balaam's example. They were putting stumbling blocks before people. And so with this in mind, with that little references from the Second Testament, we're going to jump back to the First Testament, to the book of Numbers, chapter 22. If you want to turn there, go ahead. I'll have it up on the screen. And don't worry, it's actually chapters 22, chapters 23, chapters 24. We're not going to do all of that this morning. So that's okay. But we're going to just kind of give some overviews. We're really looking in particular for what were the issues with Balaam. Why was he considered a false prophet? And why are we warned about that in the Second Testament? And so this is an interesting passage starting in Numbers 22 because it's one of those passages that aren't a whole lot about him. That's not about the Israelites. This is actually a passage about their enemies. Most of the time when we read the First Testament, we're reading about the Israelites, right? When we read about the Israelites in Egypt, we're reading about the Israelites. We're not reading about the Egyptians that had Israelite slaves. We know that happened, but that's not the perspective. We're not hearing the Egyptian side of the story. In this case, we're hearing the story from the other side. And so, Numbers 22, it starts out with this group of people. The Israelites are camped on the east side of the Jordan River. They've come up out of captivity. They've come up out of Egypt. Several million of them, it's thought. I think there were like 600,000 men, and so then you add the women and children and have a few million people. And they're encamped on the east side of the Jordan River across from Jericho before they go in, right? And the land where they were going to go in was the land of the Moabites, right? And the Moabites were afraid of the Israelites. You might recall that the Moabites were actually descendants also have similar roots. They came from this drunken relationship between Lot and his daughter, and their child was called Moab and became the Moabites. And so this nation of Moab had a king called Balak, and it's going to get confusing because we have Balak and Balaam, and I'm going to try to keep them straight, and I apologize if I say the wrong one. But Balak was concerned about his kingdom, and rightly so, right? As an invading force that's planning on coming in of 600,000 men and 3 million people altogether maybe, and he was concerned. And so, not knowing what else to do, it's like the last straw, he calls for a prophet. He calls for a seer, and he sends a message to this seer. And that's what we're going to pick up in Numbers chapter 22, starting with verse 5. About halfway through it says, this is what Balak says. He says, behold, a people has come out of Egypt. They cover the face of the earth, and they are dwelling opposite me. Come now, curse this people for me, since they are too mighty for me. Perhaps I will be able to defeat them and drive them from the land. For I know he whom you bless is blessed, and he whom you curse is cursed. So Balak is sending this message to Balaam, a prophet, saying, come, I'm afraid of this. I don't know what else to do. Come and curse these people. And he's kind of turning to God, right? He's looking for another source. And don't we do the same thing? When we're at our wit's end, when we're at the end of our rope, we don't know what else to do, we turn to God, right? We go to medical care, which is great. We probably should do it more often, right? But when the doctor says, I'm sorry, there's nothing else I can do for you, that is when we get serious on our knees, right? Or when our marriage is falling apart, or when we have financial trouble or something else. It's like when we exhaust our own power, when we exhaust what we can do on our own, we go to God, we go to a higher source. And that's what Balak was doing. He's going, I don't have a chance against these people, so come, bring your God, help me out. And so Balak sent this message, and with them, with the people that took the message, with this entourage, this group of people, he sent them a bunch of cash, the fees for divination. And when they arrived, Balaam went out and he met them, and he asked them what they wanted, and they told him. And Balaam, here we go, Balaam was not quite sure what to do. And so he tells them, he said to them, lodge here tonight, and I'll bring back word to you as the Lord speaks to me. Right? And so they stayed the night. And during the night, God and Balaam had a conversation. And we're not going to go through the whole thing. You can read it on your own if you want. And God asked him, he said, who are these guys that are staying with you? And Balaam said, well, they came from Balak. They're Moabites. They came. They want me to bless their people. And God then replied. And in verse 12, it says, God said to Balaam, you shall not go with them. You shall not curse the people, for they are blessed. So Balaam rose in the morning and said to the princes of Balak, go to your land, for the Lord has refused to let me go with you. So the princes of Moab rose and went to Balak and said, Balaam refuses to come. And man, if it ended there, if it just ended there, Balaam he'd be gold, right? He was doing great up to this point. He had something come up. He didn't know how to handle it. He went to God. God answered him, and he followed through. God said, don't go. Balaam said, I ain't going. Right? If the story ended there. But this group, they got back to Balak, and they told Balak, they told him what Balaam had said. They said, he's not coming. And Balak's like, no, he needs to come. So he sent more representatives. He sent more in number, he sent more in rank, and he sent more resources to them. More resources to try to get Balaam to come. And he said, this is the message. He says, tell him, let nothing hinder you from coming, for I will surely do great honor. And whatever you say to me, I will do. Come, curse this people for me. But Balaam answered and said to the servants of Balak, though Balak were to give me his house full of silver and gold, I could not go beyond the command of the Lord my God and do less or more. And again, if we would stop there, if the story ended there, we would think, wow, go Balaam. You nailed this one. You were tested. You nailed it, right? But then Balaam goes on. He says, but you know what? Stay here tonight that I may know what more the Lord will say to me. And God came to Balaam at night and said to him, if the men have come to call you, rise, go with them, but only do what I tell you to do. And that's the problem. See, he went back to God. He went back because he didn't like the answer. And remember last week I told you about my dog. And I said my dog is like kind of like sin, because if the door is just cracked open, she's an outside dog and she has a little mat just inside the door she's allowed on. And so when it gets cold or when it gets wet or something, she wants in. And she'll paw on the threshold of the door and we can kind of hear her. And if that door just cracks open, she pushes and get in and she comes and she rolls up on her mat and then she's happy. But see, my dog being an outside dog in the country, she is a bit of a hunter. And so she often is bringing us raccoons, or sometimes she brings us groundhogs. And groundhogs are nasty fights. She's got the scars to prove that groundhogs put up a fight. But she's brought us several groundhogs. She's brought us some possums. She's brought us who knows how many moles. She'll dig up and follow the moles. But she still wants in the house. Well, this week, my dog decided to take on a skunk. Yeah, you can guess how that went, right? And so I went out to go to work one morning, and I'm like, what is that smell? And I'm looking at the car as I'm walking, because I'm like, is that leaking fuel? Well, I don't know what I'm thinking here. And I went to work, and then a few hours later, my wife called me, and she goes, I don't know if we got a gas leak or what. She goes, it really stinks around here. And I was like, yeah, I kind of noticed it. I'll come home and check it out. And so I went home, and you could smell it a little bit in the house, but not too bad. But outside, it was bad. And I walked around, and I realized this smell was right at the front door, and where she's got an old carpet scrap that she lies on. And finally, I bent down and smelled my dog. And I realized where the smell was coming from and what happens. But the thing is that as she's like sin, because if that door cracks open, not only does she come in, but it would permeate the whole house, right? So it's not just the dog now. It's like the dog comes in, but that sin is there, and that sin starts to affect other things until it goes on and on. And Balaam, he just cracked open the door. He just cracked open the door because God had already given his answer. God said, no, don't go with them. No, they're blessed. And then Balaam's like, but look at all this they're bringing me. Look at all this wealth I could have. I could even give some back to you, right? It would be in my huge advantage to go with them, God, so why don't you let me go? And he even kind of threw out of mind, it's like, his house full of gold and silver wouldn't be enough, but maybe 2 times it, maybe that would, And so Balaam ends up going with him, and God was angry. God had told him he could go, but God had previously told him no, and God was angry because he didn't take that first no. And so he went, but the only reason that God let him go was because he persisted. It wasn't his will. It wasn't what God wanted. And then we get to this account that you probably all remember about Balaam, the speaking donkey, right? This is like the Shrek version. I wish I could do the Shrek voice and the donkey voice, right? Come on, donkey. But this is that version. And so we have Balaam, and he's on his donkey, and an angel of the Lord blocks his path, right? And the donkey sees the angel. Balaam doesn't. And the donkey's like, this doesn't look good. This isn't good, right? So what's he do? The donkey's like, I don't care about you, Balaam, but I'm not getting close to that guy. And he takes off through the field, and he goes around. And Balaam is angry, right? He beats his donkey, and you know what? I probably would too if I was on a donkey and I'm going down this path and all of a sudden for no reason that I can see, the donkey veers off the path and goes out in the field, I'm going to be hauling on that rein and beating that donkey and trying to get him back where he's supposed to be. Right? It's what we do. And so the donkey avoided the angel. And they went farther down the path. And the angel went down and got in the path again. But this time, the angel got to where the path was narrower. There was a wall on each side. So the donkey couldn't just run out in the field. And the donkey again is looking at this going, this doesn't look good. I'm trying to avoid this. And so the donkey squeezes over against the wall. And as he does so, he scrapes Balaam's leg on the wall. He crushes Balaam's leg as they're going. And Balaam is furious with this donkey. Stupid thing. And he's beating it and trying to get it back. And the donkey just stays out of reach of the angel. And he keeps going down the path. Right? And then they get a little bit farther down. And the angel appears again. But this time in an area of the path that's so narrow that the donkey knows that he's going to be dead if he goes through there. This angel is standing there with a sword. There is no way to pass. And so what does the donkey do? The donkey lies down. Right? Smart. I mean, what are you going to do? Are you going to walk? Are you going to proceed within striking distance of a guy with a sword? Or are you going to lie down? The donkey's like, look, I can go take on that angel with a sword, or I can let you beat me. Which is it going to be? Right? Have at me, Balaam, because there's no way I'm going near that guy. Which is also a lesson for us. Right? When God wants us to do something, what are we going to do? Are we going to go against his will, even if it means getting beat by people around us? Or are we going to go against God's will and take his wrath? Right? We encounter things all the time that aren't popular. They're not popular. But if it's what God says to do, you've got a choice. If it's not popular, you might get beaten by the guy with the rod. But you'll be in God's will. And at this point, the donkey is there, and Balaam's bleeding on it. This is in Numbers 22. And the donkey starts to speak. One of two animals in the Bible that speaks. The serpent in the garden and Balaam's donkey. And the donkey, in Kurt's paraphrase, like, why do you keep hammering on? Why do you keep beating on me? And Balaam's like, because you're making me look like a fool, you stupid donkey. So you make it look like I haven't trained you. You make it look like you're just stubborn, and you are. If I had a sword right now, I would kill you. And the donkey looks at him and goes, really? Really? You don't know me better than that? All the years that I've been your donkey, all the places I've carried you, have I ever done anything like this? He says, you think there might be a reason? Really? You think there might be a reason I'm acting this way? And at that point, God opens up Balaam's eyes. And Balaam sees the angel of the Lord standing there with a drawn sword. Now that would get your attention, right? I mean, if a talking donkey didn't get your attention, standing face to face with an angel with a sword who's ready to part your hair or part your head from your body or whatever, that would get your attention. And Balaam at this point, he realizes God is not messing around. God is serious. And he's like, I think I'll go home. I'm ready to go home. I'll go home, God. And God's like, no, at this point, you keep going. At this point, keep going. And so he did. But God said, from this point on, speak only what I tell you. Only bless who I tell you to bless. Only curse who I tell you to curse. Don't listen to anybody else. And so Balaam does. He goes, and Balak takes him out, and they look at the Israelites camped out there, and Balak is like, well, okay, curse these people. And Balaam blesses them. And Balak gets angry. And he says, no, I said to curse them. And Balaam, he blesses them again. And it goes on. And eventually that's the story kind of ends there. And so this man, Balaam, is like, okay, so what was his sin? All right, because it seems like he kind of listens to God. But yet he's listed in Jude as a false prophet. He's listed in 2 Peter and in Revelation, all for that matter. But he inquired of God, right? He didn't curse the Israelites. What did he do that was wrong? Well, one thing is that he was in it for his own good, right? He wanted that gain that would come. And he kept hoping that God would change his mind, that, all this money is there for me. If I just do this, just let me do this, God, and I'll have all this. But God had been very clear to him. But don't we do the same thing sometimes? God tells us something, and then we go back and say, oh, God, are you sure? Are you sure? And we say, we want to make sure, but normally it's because we don't like his answer. And we go back to him again and again, hoping that he'll tell us something different. But there's something else that Balaam did that I want to look at. Because when this account ends in chapter 24, it goes right into chapter 25. And chapter 25 is the account of Phineas. And I don't know if that rings any bells. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but in February of last year, I preached on Phineas here. I had to go back and check my notes because I couldn't remember for sure if I had shared that passage here. But this was a time when the Israelites were intermarrying and having relationships with the Moabites and the Midianites. And Phineas, the people were gathered outside the tent. God was angry with the people. He had put a plague on them. I think the plague killed 60-some thousand of them because of their unfaithfulness. And they're standing outside the tent with Moses, and an Israelite man takes a Midianite woman, and he walks past them into his tent. And Phineas is like, this is our problem, people. We can't God said no. Phineas takes his spear, and he goes, and he drives it through the two of them. Anyone remember that? If not, you can probably go back and find it online, right? It was one of those sermons I really didn't want to preach. But Phineas killed it. And then Phineas was in Psalms, he's called out for his faithfulness, for his passion for God. And when he did this, the plague stopped because of his actions, because of his zeal for the Lord. But this happens right after the story of Balaam, right? Right after the story of Balaam, we have this account of the idolatry and the sexual immorality and all the problems it was causing for the Israelites. They were told to have one God. The Moabites and the Midianites were bringing in other gods. They were told to be sexually pure. They were told not to intermarry with these other people. And it goes right from Balaam to this, and it's like, okay, so what's happening in there? Well, interesting, if we go all the way up to chapter 31, because God commands the Israelites to destroy the Midianites. And the Israelites go out and they destroy most of the men. And they bring back many of the women. And Moses is like, what? What are you guys doing? Continuing on, it says, and Moses was angry with his officers of the army, the commanders of thousands and the commanders of hundreds, and those who came from service in the war. Moses said to them, have you let all the women live? Behold, these on Balaam's advice caused the people of Israel to act treacherously against the Lord in the incidents of Peor. So the plague came among the congregation of the Lord. It's a piece that we were missing in the puzzle. You see what Balaam did? Balaam told them, he told the Midianites that if you can integrate with them, if you can let your women go with them, you will be able to take your gods with you. You will be able to intermarry with them. You will break down their society, and you will make them despicable in the sight of their God. And that's what happened, because we know if we go back that God sent a plague and killed 60-some thousand of them because of that. So this too was a sin of Balaam. He was undermining the people of God. His motivation was money, and he didn't want to take God's words, but then he passed on knowledge to help weaken the Israelites, to diminish their respect for God, to make them stink in God's sight. And that is exactly what the false prophets Jude is warning about are doing as well. See, they're more concerned with themselves than the church, right? They don't care about the body, but they want for themselves. They're looking for that gain, just like Balaam was. But and Jude, he says they're like shepherds that feed themselves instead of their flocks. But he also says they're like wandering stars that you can't navigate with. Because You got to have, like I said, that stationary star has to be your point of reference. If you know where one thing is, you can find other things. But if that one thing is moving around, you'll never get where you're going. And for us to navigate closer to God, we need that star. We need that thing that is stationary, that thing that is unchanging, that thing that is everlasting. We need His Word, right? This doesn't change. This is our reference. And the false prophets, they like to warp things like a moving star. And God didn't mean that. Sound familiar? Go back to Genesis. That sounds very familiar, right? God did He really mean that? Or they say, but God loves you the way you are. God does love us, but He doesn't want us to stay the way we are, right? These false prophets, they want us to question God's word. They want to bring in other sources. But this is what we need right here. This is what we need. And Jude is telling us to stand firm with it, to be aware of the false prophets and don't listen to them. It was a warning then, it's a warning now, and it's one that we need to pay attention to. And if there's somebody here who is confused by it, who is searching for that point, searching for God, then come talk to me. He doesn't change. I'd love to talk to you about Him. That's why we're here. So next week I'm preaching at Westchester. The week after that, I'm at Kelowna Mennonite, but I do invite you to come back in 3 weeks. We're going to hopefully wrap up this series November 5th. We're going to be looking at the last of the people. We're going to be looking at Korah and seeing why he was defined as a false prophet and why we are warned against people like him. So again, until then, thank you for allowing me to come. Be ever on your guard as we continue on our journey together.